Next, I would like to invite Ambassador Bloomfield, the Special Envoy for MANDAF's Man-Portable Air Defense System Threat Reduction Forum from 2008 to 2009. He is chairman of the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., president of Palmer Coates, LLC, and non-attorney consultant at Aiken, Gum, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, LLP. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Hamid. And good evening, everyone. It's a great honor for me to be with you tonight. It's an even greater honor for me to share a stage with Sheila. And I want to thank her for her great courage and fortitude in telling her story publicly tonight. It's very compelling, and I think it's more important than most of the information that we talk about in Washington when we speak of Iran. This is very powerful information. I dare say it's not rare information. It's not an isolated case. It's not rare, human rights abuse in Iran, but the story is largely untold. So it's a very important event when this testimony comes out. And so let's save the film. Let's make sure a lot of people see it. I came to study the PMOI, the MEK, a few years ago just because groups like the Northern California group were interested in having their name cleared in Washington. The group was listed as a terrorist organization in America and many other countries. So I traveled to France several times. I met Iranian Americans. I learned that there are stories not always as heartbreaking and compelling and shocking as Sheila's story, but of a similar kind. Many, many, many stories reflected in the photographs that you see here. And I learned that what people in Washington were saying about the Mujahideen Ikhalq was not the same as the facts that I was learning. And I became concerned on two fronts. As an American who had served in the government, I became very concerned that false information was considered true by my colleagues. And as we were approaching a nuclear negotiation, I thought, if there is a counterintelligence problem in Washington, if we are believing certain factions are good and certain factions are bad, and these are the people we trust and these are the people we must never trust, and if this is distorted and false and propagandistic information, our intelligence community must know this before we begin to talk about nuclear weapons. And so I started to write about these allegations about the MEK. What was the difference between what the press and officials commonly believed, including official reports on terrorist groups? And what did the real facts tell us? And I drew a question mark on every one of these allegations. But every time I did this, someone in Washington would say, oh, but you missed something. The MEK is a cult. And then I would talk about that, and they say, oh, you missed something. They conducted a major terrorist operation in 1991. They stormed the consulate in Canada. This, that, and the other thing. So I finally said, there's only one way to address this. And so I wrote a history of 47 years of the origin of the MEK to the present day. It's not a complete history. It's a very thin narrative. But it's enough for anyone who doesn't know who the Mujahideen Ikhalq is, why they started, how they started, in a university just like Berkeley, with people just like intelligent, optimistic, idealistic Berkeley students, and where it all went, and why violence happened. And so, after the book came out, I think we stopped hearing the allegations in Washington, and now the MEK is on no terrorism lists of any free country. But I learned that only by seeing the regime through the eyes of people like Sheila, this is how you learn who this regime is. Why would they do these things? Why would they do so many things? So many things I've heard from people in this audience as well. There are tens of thousands of victims, and their surviving relatives tell their stories, and we learn who was sitting across the table from the P5+1 when we did the nuclear negotiation. And I will give you the bottom line. This is a regime that has crimes against humanity on their hands. Not just the top person, not just the top 5 people, but specific individuals. The Minister of Justice today, under President Rouhani, who signed off on all of the executions that Sheila just told you about when he was in the intelligence ministry. And many others were directly implicated and would be found guilty of crimes against humanity if there were a trial. And there's so much more happening even now, as you know, when you talk to your relatives. People are disappearing even now. We only hear about some of them. Maybe it's 1,000 this year. Maybe it's a lot more. But even if it's 1,000 executions, on a per capita basis in America, that would be the equivalent of something like 11 executions a day. An unbelievable number by any standard. 4,000 executions in America. Think about that. So when we talk about trying to work with the regime in Tehran, in Washington, when we talk about trying to moderate their behavior, trying to reform them, there's one key point that they haven't yet understood in Washington, which is that this regime has nowhere to go except to try to survive by force. Everything they do is about staying in power. It's not about money. It's not about prestige. It's not about territory. It's not about oil. It's about staying in power against all sorts of risks to their survival, because the minute they lose control, there is no future for them. They end up like Ceausescu or any of a number of other despotic regimes. So their sole purpose is survival. Once you understand that, looking at the nuclear talks, it looks a lot different to someone like me. In Washington today, both sides are polarized. They are talking past each other. Neither side respects the other's arguments, which is very sad, because they should respect. Each one has something to say, and the other side should listen to it. And neither side is debating the important question. Of course, there's a nuclear agreement in front of the Congress. Everyone's talking about the provisions. I won't do that tonight unless you want to ask me about it. But they're not talking about what happens the day after the vote in Congress, less than a month from now. What happens then? It's not just what happens with cheating or inspections or centrifuge or changing the grade of uranium enrichment. What's the policy with Iran? That's the question that Congress should be debating. On one side, to be honest, I have many friends in government who have studied nuclear disarmament. They came out of the Cold War. They studied at places like MIT, where my father was a professor of political science, and came to Washington to try to stop nuclear war with the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They are experts on nonproliferation, verification, compliance. I respect these people. Most of them, including here in Berkeley, I'm sure, passionately think that a nuclear deal with a rogue state is what they have been asking for years. What could be wrong with a disarmament agreement, a nuclear disarmament agreement that puts some curbs on Iran? To them, they don't understand any downside. And I respect them because they're not political experts. They've never heard this story. They've never heard any of the things that I've heard. On the other side, you have the Congress, who is upset. There are 4 Americans being held in captivity in Iran, including the Washington Post correspondent. There are many issues. They've destabilized Syria, Iraq, Yemen, so many things going on. They're running basically a non-state crime ring, and of course the human rights abuses inside. In many ways, all of these are a direct violation of U.S. principles. Everything we claim to stand for as Americans, as a government. We're supposed to be vigilant about human rights and respect for women. We are supposed to be concerned about corruption and trafficking. We are supposed to be encouraging state behavior and discouraging non-state actors with military weapons. And yet the Revolutionary Guards are arming militias all over Iraq, Shia militias, and the Hezbollah, and Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen, and others. All of our principles are being flagrantly violated by this regime while they smile across the table in Vienna and do YouTube videos in English with music and beautiful sculpture in the background. Clearly propaganda. And yet, we don't seem to see. So Congress is furious about this, and they don't respect the president's agreement. I think the agreement has a lot to be desired as well. But if you listen to how each side talks about the agreement, it gives you a clue of where we need to go next. I won't even talk about the details of the deal. But what has the American side said? They talk about why did Iran come to the table? Because the sanctions brought them to their knees. That's too simple. That's not the only reason. This is why they came to the table. Because 1988 is haunting them. Because 1981 is haunting them. Because actually 1953 is haunting them. They claim that, I've been on television shows with their spokesman, they talk about America has been victimizing Iran for a long time. They overthrew Mossadegh. Well, yes, that's true. But whose side were you on? The clerics? They sided with the Shah and with the generals against Mossadegh. So let's not pretend that they're the victim. They've co-opted history. Even the president the other day, President Obama, referred to the theocrats who overthrew the Shah. I stopped cold when I heard him say that at American University. The theocrats who overthrew the Shah? No. This revolution came from everywhere in Iran. The Shah fell. Khomeini was a very colorful figure in Paris. And he had cassettes floating around, and yes, people were interested in Khomeini. He was a big press story when he came. But look what happened between 1979 and 1981. No one in Washington knows that story. They haven't read my book. It's because we had hostages. They weren't interested in the politics. It was a free and open political season. But Khomeini had a different idea. As soon as he came to Iran, he wanted dictatorship. And he wanted everyone to sign up to Velayat-e-Faqih. And when Masoud Rajavi wouldn't sign up, after he asked him to his face, he ended up with a death threat against Masoud Rajavi, who would have won millions of votes had he run for president. And so most Americans don't understand why Ayatollah Montazeri didn't become the supreme leader in 1989 when Khomeini died. Most American policymakers can't answer the question of why did Bani Sadr have to leave the country in 1981? Why did he go to Paris? Well, if you saw the hundreds of thousands of Iranians in the streets protesting what the clerics were doing, you would understand. And if you knew what happened in July of 1981, when they brought out all the guns and shot their way to power, then you would begin to understand the thin ice underneath the regime today. But again, the American rhetoric doesn't reflect this knowledge at all. There are many things that they're saying. Why do they need nuclear establishment? Because of energy. Well, I was chairing a panel, many of you were in Paris, when the former deputy director of the IAEA, Ali Heinonen, who is at Harvard now, told the story that as an IAEA official, they had examined Iran's national data on uranium supplies, uranium, the availability of uranium in Iran at different price points. And at any conceivable commercial price point for uranium, Iran has enough uranium to run the Bushehr reactor for 5 years. That's it. There's no more. So the idea that they need Fordo and these other facilities in order to have energy, an alternative to the oil and gas reserves which they have, simply is false. And so if you look at what the Iranians say, it's about their rights. You need to respect our rights. Why are you giving us a regime which has so many more details than any other nuclear state? We're being asked to do more than anyone. You Americans have always victimized us. You don't treat us fairly. You don't respect us, etc. Well, it is all about rights. And one thing that I don't think the American side realized is just sitting publicly in Vienna across the table from all of these Western countries and from Russia and China and the European Union, the United Nations, for 2 years, was a message to everyone. You see, look who's the legitimate power of Iran. And having a deal which said, instead of mistrusting your nuclear program, now it's legal. You have a legal program, even if it's under constraints for several years. It's legal. It's authorized. That's a big change. It was never authorized under President Bush. Mr. Obama likes to talk about the Bush years. It was completely illicit and unauthorized. Now it's legal. That's what matters to them, is the legitimacy that they're gaining from this. So in some ways, and then the final point that I'll talk about is President Obama now says, I understand about the hostages, I understand about the instability in the region and human rights at home, but we were solely focused on getting a nuclear agreement. No, sir. No, you weren't. If you were solely focused on getting a nuclear agreement, then the other issues could be dealt with separately. And the fact is, and the administration people have said this over and over, is that they didn't want to perturb the negotiations by intervening in Syria. It might disturb the goodwill inside the negotiating room. Do you think anyone in Tehran asked whether the Americans would mind if they drove 4 million Syrians out of Syria and put them into refugee camps where we're paying several $billion so far to keep them until they grow up to become angry people with guns and cell phones because they've lost their country and we did nothing? I think the Iranians showed zero consideration of American national security interests, and the U.S., for some reason, didn't reciprocate. Yes, we connected all those issues. We sat on our hands for 2 years hoping for a nuclear deal. We never walked away from the table either. And so, in so many ways, I could talk about the negotiating strategy. We never went in with a strong offer. We never insisted that the supreme leader make the decision. You can't take nuclear weapons away from a subordinate. Only the supreme leader can be the statesman who says, we are giving up these terrible weapons. I never wanted them anyway, and the Americans are giving us respect and all these other things. We didn't even ask for that. Everything they got in the deal, they got out of concessions along the way, which is not the way to negotiate with senior people in the Middle East. So here's quickly my story of what really happened. The Iran regime was in great pain economically when oil prices collapsed and the rial collapsed. This is true. 2012, early 2013, they had a big problem. But I don't think that was the real problem. The real problem was when the Arab Spring reached Daraa in Syria in 2011, because it had been in the streets of Tehran in 2009 when Ahmadinejad's election fraud became a public issue and people took to the streets. The revolution was back. And so when they saw it reach Syria after it had taken down Ben Ali and Mubarak in Tunisia and Egypt, they could not afford to lose Bashar al-Assad. And so they went all in to Syria. And the president, Obama, almost went in with some kind of targeted use of military force. In the end, he backed off. He backed off completely. The fleet sailed away. If I had a tape recorder in the Supreme Leaders Council the day the military option went away, I would not be surprised to hear them say, you know what? They don't have any leverage on us to take away our nuclear weapons. What are they going to do to us? So we lost our leverage in Syria at the negotiating table in Vienna. I sound like a heretic saying that in Washington, so I don't say it, because people in Washington have limited portfolios. They're non-proliferation experts. They're Iran people. They're Syria people, but they're not the same people. So when I try to connect the strategic dots, and when I hear the president say the P5+1 are absolutely united in this needing to curb Iran's nuclear ambition, really? Why did the Russians move in and sign a nuclear deal right in the middle of the talks? Why did the Chinese start buying cheap oil from Iran before the sanctions were lifted? Why did the Germans send a vice minister with 3 major multinational companies last week? Why did the British open their embassy in Tehran last Sunday? It doesn't sound to me like they're worried about nuclear proliferation. That's the superpower will take care of that. We're off the hook. And I think that you're going to see some engagement. They're going to get economic activity. So what do we do about this? I know that my time is short, but I think that 2 things need to happen. A third one isn't going to happen. Let me just give you a quote, some good advice. We should be domestically united when dealing with or fighting a foreign enemy. Sadly, that quote is not from Washington. It's from the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, in Persian press. We're not united in Washington. We need to rediscover our principles. We need to say America will not always shed blood for other people, but we will not sit quietly when human rights are abused, certainly not at a scale of crimes against humanity. We will not sit quietly as a country is absolutely destroyed. And I could go into detail, but ISIS was allowed to be created in Syria because Bashar al-Assad needed to create a bonfire as a distraction and a diversion. And he is still feeding that bonfire of ISIS, and they are cooperating behind the scenes on many fronts in order that between the two of them, they will get rid of all the enemies, particularly the moderate Syrian resistance that we are trying to, without success, to develop. He wants to be the westernized last man standing. 2 years ago, we had a presidential red line to remove him from office. That's gone now. Why should the Iranians give up the nuclear weapon when Bashar is saved? There's no nuclear threat from America. We're fine. We're going to make it. So the first thing we should do is rediscover our principles and then take another look through that lens. But the second thing we should do is be imaginative and realize that whether the president meant to do it or not, he has put a large hourglass on the table, and the sand is in there that will last for 5 to 15 years. And when that sand runs out of the hourglass, if the people who did this to Sheila and the people she described are still in power, they will have nuclear weapons. They will be a month or two from a breakout capability. They will have dual-use centrifuges that are several times better that we are allowing them to develop along the way. They'll have missiles, they'll have arms deals. So that hourglass is now running. The president put that hourglass. We used to have no limit on how long it would take to reform Iran for the Iranian people to gain their sovereignty. Now we have a very short time to work with. So how do we do it? The problem is when you say something like regime change, the president and others start to say neoconservative, Bush, Iraq war. It becomes a polarizing term. No one's talking about war. No one's talking about neoconservatives. No one's talking about regime change. What we're talking about is empowering 80 million people not to be intimidated, killed, and bullied by the mullahs. How do we do that? I don't think we do it the old-fashioned way. I think we look around us and say, how did Khomeini do it? He sent cassettes into Iran, remember? Some of us are old enough, that's what he did. Where are our cassettes? Well, Iran National TV is one excellent source. But here's what I really am trying to say. If they're going to get a lot of money, which they will claim that they're helping the people. And we will not be sure one way or the other. You can tell the intelligence community can't tell how much goes to the Revolutionary Guards. They can't tell where the money goes. They'll build some roads and there'll be some visible structures and they'll hand out some cash. That's not good enough. We need to figure out a way to track the money, to put a spotlight on the money, and to have everyone in Iran see where the money goes. It's their money. And then we need to put a spotlight on the regime's behavior of all of these executions and the justice system and the corrupt system of the Revolutionary Guards, who, by the way, are profiting from sanctions. Sanctions make regimes very rich. Gaddafi and Saddam both died with almost $20 billion each in the bank. We think the Supreme Leader may have $90 billion in the religious foundations that control all of those industries. That's from the Reuters news service, and I urge you to look it up. He should be on the cover of Forbes magazine as the world's richest man, with apologies to Bill Gates, who I guess is a West Coast icon. He may be the richest man in the world. If he had to answer to headlines around the world and also people knowing that everyone he sees on the street of Iran knows where the money went, knows how his kids are profiting, knows about bank accounts, knows about non-religious behavior among the elite, the hypocrisy and the cruelty, and how much is going to Arabs. And you know, if we could turn the lights on and use information to break through the Revolutionary Guard's information command, I think that's more powerful than guns. It certainly was more powerful than guns when it brought down 2 regimes in Tunisia and Egypt without a shot being fired. So my final point is this. What I'm really saying is that the bullets here are not military. The bullets are stories. It's truth. It's testimony. It's witness. I have met so many Iranians now in Europe and America who tell stories, and the stories are all different. They're all special. They're all sacred. And I have seen at the rallies that Madame Rajavi hosts and others how much respect and honor is accorded to people who have died simply because they would not accept dictatorship, and how much honor is accorded them by their surviving relatives. No one in Washington, except a few congressmen, knows this. It's time for this story and 1,000 other stories that are here in America, in houses here in California and all over the country, to start to come out. I know why people stayed quiet before 2012. MEK was on the terrorism list. But that was illegitimate. They hadn't done anything in over a decade, and then it was armed resistance, as the French courts made clear before that. So my message to you is to understand how powerful your story is. If there's a way to do it without endangering relatives, let's figure that out. But let's start telling Washington that hundreds and thousands of Iranians in the North America and Europe have all borne witness to something that the Washington policy establishment doesn't seem to know. Please work with me and others. Let's bring these stories out, and let's call them 1,000 flowers, not 1,000 bullets. But this is what the regime can no longer tolerate. They cannot tolerate the truth, and the truth belongs to you. Thank you.